ever feel like we're kind of living through history as it's happening.
Right.
It's wild, someday what we're going through, and now W will be in textbooks and stuff.
Yeah.
But to really get what's going on today, we need to understand what happened before. You know what I mean? Like, what led up to this point.
Absolutely. It's like, how can you understand something without knowing where it came from?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what we're doing today, a deep dive into the history of social welfare in Canada.
Fascinating topic.
Yeah, we got some really interesting stuff to work with.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, excerpts from a university course, a bunch of images,
Cool.
all showing how things have changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission today is to trace how Canada's approach to supporting its people has evolved.
Okay.
Like, what were those big milestones, the changing ideas that led to the system we see now?
Right.
And, of course, we'll talk about some of the debates along the way, because no historical journey is without them.
Definitely not. And those debates often show us how different values and priorities have shaped things over time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's rewind way back to the colonial period,
Okay.
roughly 1600 to 1867.
Wow.
Imagine Canada with, no modern social programs, no safety net like we have today.
Mm-hmm.
How did people get by back then?
Well, imagine living in a small community. You're relying heavily on family and your church.
Okay.
This was the era of feudalism, right?
Right.
Very hierarchical. Everyone had their place in society.
Okay, so very different from our society today.
Oh, absolutely.
So how did ideas about helping those in need fit in that whole system?
Well, the responsibility for the poor, it generally fell on those close-knit communities.
Right.
Families took care of their own, and the church would offer some assistance.
Gotcha. But were there any, organized efforts by the government?
Yes. That's where the Elizabethan Poor Laws of 1601 come in.
Okay.
They were a big attempt to address poverty, though with a very different mindset than we have now.
How so?
Well, they introduced this whole concept of the deserving and undeserving poor.
Who deserving poor?
Yeah. So those who couldn't work, age, illness, disability, they were seen as deserving of assistance.
Okay.
They might get help through almshouses or what they called outdoor relief.
Interesting. And the undeserving poor, it sounds almost like, I don't know, like a judgment call.
It was. Those deemed able-bodied but unwilling to work.
Right.
They were often seen as, lazy. Their poverty was seen as their own fault, a moral failing.
Wow.
And they might be sent to workhouses.
Workhouses, those sound kind of harsh.
They were designed to be unpleasant, really. The whole idea was to deter people from even asking for help.
Wow. It really shows how much our views on poverty and responsibility have changed, huh?
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting, those echoes of deserving versus undeserving, they still come up in some of our debates about social welfare today,
Oh, yeah, I can see that. Like discussions about who qualifies for certain programs and stuff.
Exactly. It's fascinating how these things kind of repeat themselves.
Okay, so before we jump ahead, let's talk about English Canada versus Quebec during this period. Were there differences in how they approached social welfare?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So in Quebec, with its French heritage, they had a very church-based model. Religious institutions, private charities, they played a huge role.
Makes sense. And English Canada.
They were more influenced by the English Poor Laws. So a bit of government involvement, though very limited.
Gotcha. Different approaches reflecting those different cultural influences.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now fast forward a bit. Confederation happens in 1867, and Canada enters this industrial period, 1868 to 1940.
Big changes.
Yeah, huge changes. This is the era of rapid change driven by, factories and all that.
Industrialization, yeah.
Exactly. Factories popping up everywhere, cities growing like crazy.
Yep.
But all this also led to new problems for folks just trying to make ends meet.
For sure.
So paint us a picture.
Yeah.
What were those problems like?
Okay, so imagine working in a factory, right? Dangerous machinery, not a lot of safety regulations, injuries were incredibly common, even deaths.
Oh, wow.
Plus, unemployment, that became a huge issue as the economy went up and down.
So those informal support systems, like the families and churches we talked about,
Yeah.
they just couldn't keep up with all that.
No, they were overwhelmed.
So did this lead to a change in how Canada approached, social welfare?
It did. The industrial period saw the rise of more organized, formalized social welfare programs.
Okay.
One big turning point. The Workers' Compensation Act of 1914.
Why was that one so important?
It was a direct response to all those workplace injuries and deaths, remember?
Right.
Created a system where if you got hurt on the job, you could get compensation.
that makes sense.
It was huge because for the first time, it acknowledged that employers had a responsibility for worker safety.
Right, right. Any other big changes during this time?
Oh, yeah. The Mother's Allowance Program started in 1920.
Okay.
Think about the social norms back then. This program was huge. It recognized that single mothers needed help, financial support to raise their kids.
Wow, so Canada was starting to take on a more active role in, like, social issues, not just basic poverty.
Definitely. This period was all about a more interventionist approach.
Okay.
The government was realizing that modern society needed more than just, those ad hoc solutions.
Makes sense. It also feels like a key time for women's rights, right?
Absolutely. Women were fighting for the right to vote, demanding a voice in social issues.
Right.
This activism played a big role in shaping social welfare.
Gotcha. Any specific example of that?
The Persons Case of 1929.
The Persons Case.
So this was a legal battle. A group of women in Alberta, the famous Five,
Okay.
they challenged the definition of persons in the British North America Act.
Why was that definition so important?
Well, back then, women weren't considered persons under the law,
Really?
which meant they couldn't be appointed to the Senate.
Wow.
The famous Five, they won their case.
Good for them.
Yeah, it paved the way for women to have a bigger say in the political decisions that shape their lives.
Right, including those related to social welfare.
Exactly. So even something as seemingly basic as who is a person had huge implications.
Well, that's really interesting. And women were also fighting for the right to vote provincially, right?
Oh, absolutely. Manitoba was actually the first.
Oh, okay. When was that?
1916, they led the way.
Interesting. What about Indigenous women? Did they have the right to vote during this period?
Unfortunately, no. They weren't covered by the Indian Act.
Oh, right.
They couldn't vote in band council elections until much later, 1951.
Wow. So the fight for their rights continued for a lot longer.
It did.
It's a good reminder that progress isn't always, straightforward or even across the board.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we've talked about women's rights, but what about seniors? Were there any developments aimed at helping them specifically?
Yes, in 1927, the Old Age Pensions Act was introduced.
Okay.
It was kind of like a first step toward what we now know as old age security.
So it acknowledged that seniors often needed help financially.
Yeah, to live with dignity in their retirement.
Makes sense. It sounds like things were slowly moving toward a more comprehensive safety net, but then, bam, the Great Depression hits.
Yeah, the crash of 1929.
It feels like that was a turning point for how people viewed poverty, right?
It was. It challenged that whole idea that poverty was a personal failing.
Right, because suddenly so many people were struggling.
Exactly. It didn't matter how hard you worked or your background.
Right.
The suffering was massive.
Yeah, I remember learning about the On to Ottawa Trek in school.
Ah, yes.
It's-
1935.
Thousands of unemployed men marching across the country.
Demanding better work conditions and relief programs.
That must have been a powerful sight.
It was. It sadly ended in tragedy, a clash with police in Regina. But it made an impact. Canadians were forced to see the realities of systemic poverty.
So did the government respond to all this? All these demands for change?
They did. In 1940, the Unemployment Insurance Act was passed. This was huge. For the first time, the government acknowledged they needed to step in and deal with unemployment specifically.
So a real shift toward a more comprehensive approach.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. So we've seen how the industrial period really shook things up in terms of how Canada viewed social responsibility.
It did.
But that was just the beginning. Next time, we'll explore what many call the golden age of Canadian social welfare, the welfare state era.
Can't wait.
Me neither. Okay, so last time we talked about how Canada's approach to social welfare, really started to take shape during that industrial period.
Right.
The government stepping in to deal with workplace safety, unemployment, all that.
Yeah, things were definitely changing.
It felt like a real turning point.
It was, and that momentum, it kind of carried forward into what many consider the golden age of Canadian social welfare.
Ooh, the golden age.
The welfare state era,
Yeah.
roughly from 1941 to 1974.
Okay, set the scene for us. What was happening in the world that led to this specific period?
Well, imagine, right, a world coming out of World War II,
Okay.
devastating war, but there was this real desire to build a better future, not just to rebuild, but to create a more just and equitable society.
Okay, so a real sense of hope, possibility.
Exactly. And along with that, this grown belief that governments, they had a responsibility to ensure the well-being of their citizens.
Okay, so this period saw a real expansion of, social programs in Canada.
It did. Think of it like building a strong foundation for a house,
Okay.
The welfare state era was all about creating this comprehensive set of programs aimed at supporting Canadians throughout their lives.
Okay, so what were some of the key programs that were introduced during this time?
Well, remember we talked about the Old Age Pensions Act from back in 1927?
Yeah.
Those early pensions, they were expanded significantly.
Okay.
Eventually, they evolved into the retirement system we have today,
Okay, like old age security and the Canada Pension Plan.
Exact.
So safety net for seniors, basically.
Yeah, but it wasn't just about seniors. What about support for families?
Right, yeah.
That's where the Family Allowance Act comes in.
Okay, the Family Allowance Act.
Introduced in 1944, it gave a monthly payment to families with kids under 16.
Okay.
It didn't matter how much money they made.
Wow, so a universal benefit for all families.
It was a huge step. It wasn't about targeting certain groups anymore. It was about investing in all families.
That's pretty progressive, especially for that time.
It was a big shift in thinking.
Yeah, for sure. So how would you describe, like, the core values of this whole welfare state model?
Well, the idea was that governments, they had to step in to actively promote social well-being.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't enough to just react to problems,
Right.
They needed to create a fairer society from the ground up.
Okay, so this is where we see the real emergence of those universal programs, right?
Exactly. Available to everyone, regardless of income.
Yeah.
It reflected the belief that certain needs, like healthcare, education, retirement income, those should be guaranteed for everyone.
Interesting. And speaking of healthcare, this is also when Canadian Medicare came about, right?
You got it. 1966, the Medical Care Act.
Okay.
It established universal health care in Canada.
That was a huge deal.
It was. It ensured that all Canadians, no matter how much money they had, could get the medical care they needed.
Yeah, and Canadian Medicare is like a big part of our identity, isn't it?
It is. And it wasn't easy. There were a lot of debates and challenges along the way.
I can imagine.
But it's still around, and it's very popular.
Right.
It shows how much Canadians value healthcare as a right, not a privilege.
Yeah, for sure. So to sum up this welfare state era, we see a big expansion of programs, a focus on universal benefits,
Yes.
and this strong belief in the government's role in creating a fairer society.
That's a great summary. And it was a golden age, especially compared to what came before.
Right, but every golden age has to end sometime, right? What happened?
Well, a few things. There were economic challenges, like those oil shocks in the 70s. Put a lot of pressure on government budgets.
Oh.
And the population was aging, which meant more demands on those social programs.
So a bunch of pressures from inside and outside Canada.
Yeah. And at the same time, a new political and economic philosophy was gaining traction.
Okay.
Neoliberalism. This was a big shift.
Neoliberalism, we hear that term a lot.
It questioned the whole foundation of the welfare state model.
Can you break that down for us? What does it mean and how does it relate to, social welfare?
Think of it as a philosophy that champions free markets, limited government intervention.
Okay.
It emphasizes individual responsibility.
So kind of the opposite of the welfare state model,
Yeah.
which was all about government intervention and collective responsibility.
In a way, yeah. Neoliberalism sees the market, the free market, as the best way to allocate resources, solve problems.
Interesting. So how did this new way of thinking start to influence social welfare in Canada?
Well, starting in the mid-70s, we see a gradual shift away from those universal programs. The focus moved towards more targeted, means-tested benefits.
So instead of everyone benefiting, it's just those who meet certain criteria.
Yeah, it reflects a shift in the underlying philosophy.
Okay.
Less emphasis on the collective, more on individual responsibility.
Did this also mean less funding for those programs?
Yes, absolutely. Government started cutting spending on social programs.
Okay.
Services were cut, and the overall generosity of the welfare state declined.
So a shrinking of the safety net.
You could say that. This period, from 75 to 2005, saw a real erosion of the welfare state model.
Okay. What were some of the arguments used to justify these cuts and changes?
Well, the supporters of neoliberalism, they argued that the welfare state had become too expensive. They said it wasn't sustainable.
Okay.
They also claimed that it created a culture of dependency, that it discouraged people from taking responsibility for their own lives.
So it was a shift from that we're all in this together mentality to a more you're on your own approach.
In a way, yes. The focus shifted to self-reliance, away from social solidarity.
But didn't the welfare state play a huge role in creating a more equitable society in the first place.
It did, but critics argued that it was inefficient bureaucratic,
Okay.
that it trapped people in poverty rather than helping them escape it.
So there were concerns about how the system was working, but also this new ideology pushing for a fundamental change.
Exactly. And remember, there were real economic problems during this time, too, recessions and stuff.
Right.
It made it easier to justify cutting social spending, even if those cuts aligned with this broader neoliberal agenda.
It's crazy how all these forces, economic and ideological, kind of come together and shape things.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. So what were some specific examples of those policy changes during this time?
Well, one big one was the Canada Health and Social Transfer in 1996.
Okay.
This replaced the old way the feds funded healthcare and social programs.
And how was it different?
It gave the provinces more control over how the money was spent.
Something a good thing.
Yeah, but it also meant less money overall.
Oh, I see.
Less money for those programs, and the provinces had to figure out how to make it work.
Wow. So less money and more responsibility on the provinces.
Exactly. And this had different impacts across the country, right?
Right.
Depending on each province's priorities and resources.
Right, right. What about income inequality during this period? Did this shift toward neoliberalism have any impact there?
Well, critics argued that those cuts to social programs and other neoliberal policies like, tax cuts for the wealthy, they said all that contributed to a widening gap between the rich and the poor.
And that gap is still a big problem today, isn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. It's a major challenge for Canada.
It feels like we're moving further away from that vision of a just and equitable society, the vision that kind of drove the welfare state.
Yeah, right. It's a real tension.
So where do we go from there? How did Canada handle this move away from the welfare state?
Well, in 2006, the Conservative Party, led by Stephen Harper, they came to power.
Okay.
This ushered in a period that some call retrenchment and recovery.
Okay. Retrenchment and recovery.
This lasted until 2015.
Okay.
We saw a continuation of those neoliberal policies, although with this new focus on economic recovery.
Oh, right, because of the 2008 financial crisis.
Exactly. So less government and social welfare, but a big emphasis on stabilizing the economy.
Did this involve any more cuts to social programs?
Unfortunately, yes. The Harper era saw cuts in areas like employment insurance, social assistance, affordable housing.
Oh, wow.
They also changed pension rules, raised the age you could get old age security from 65 to 67.
So that trend towards smaller government continued.
It did.
Were there any voices pushing back against this at the time?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Even with neoliberalism being so dominant, there were still debates and advocacy efforts. People were calling for a stronger social safety net.
So the debate was still alive, even though policy was going in a different direction.
Exactly. New social movements emerged, like the Occupy movement.
Oh, right, Occupy Wall Street.
It challenged that growing inequality, demanded more social justice.
That's powerful.
It shows that even when a particular ideology is dominant, there are always people fighting for alternatives.
Yeah, for sure. It feels like this kind of back and forth between different visions of social responsibility is like a constant in Canadian history.
Yeah, you're right.
So what happened next after the Harper era?
Well, in 2015, the Liberal Party, led by Justin Trudeau, they came to power.
Okay.
And with them, a noticeable shift in tone.
How so?
The Trudeau government, they talked about a more open, collaborative, evidence-based approach to governing.
Did this lead to any real changes in how they approach social welfare?
Yeah, to some extent.
Okay.
They reversed some of the cuts made by the previous government,
Okay.
especially for Indigenous communities and refugees.
Okay.
They also brought back the long-form census,
Right, right.
which gives us valuable data about social trends and inequalities.
That's important.
It felt like a move toward a more compassionate approach.
Okay, so a bit of a course correction. But was it a total break from that neoliberal mindset?
That's a good question. It's important to remember that a lot of the policies from the previous decades, they stayed in place.
So a change in talk and some policy tweaks, but not a complete overhaul.
Yeah, that's fair. And the Trudeau government, they got criticized too.
For what?
Not doing enough about income inequality, the lack of affordable housing, the climate crisis, all that.
It seems like every government faces these tough decisions,
Yeah, it's the nature of the job.
Where to put the money, how to balance different needs.
Exactly. Trying to find that sweet spot between supporting those in need, encouraging economic growth, and making sure social programs can last.
Right. And then, just as things were settling into this new normal, COVID-19 hits.
Right, the pandemic.
Like a curveball. out of nowhere.
It was a global shock, had a huge impact on social welfare everywhere.
It really showed how vulnerable a lot of people were.
It did. And it showed how important government support is during a crisis.
I remember those early days, lockdowns, so many people losing their jobs.
Yeah, it felt like the world was turned upside down. So much uncertainty, so much hardship.
And the government had to respond quickly, right?
They did. They put a bunch of emergency measures in place trying to limit the damage.
One of the biggest was CER, wasn't it?
The Canada Emergency Response Benefit,
Yeah.
it gave eligible Canadians $2,000 a month
Okay.
if they'd lost their jobs or had their hours cut because of the pandemic.
It was a lifeline for a lot of people.
It was. Millions of people.
It felt like a big shift back to a more interventionist approach.
Yeah, the government stepping in to help people directly.
Exactly.
It was unprecedented how big and how fast the response was.
Yeah, it showed what the government can do in a crisis.
It did.
And it kind of reminded everyone how important those social programs are, right?
Yeah, to protect people when things go bad.
But was it just a temporary fix? Did the pandemic, change how we think about social welfare in the long run?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It definitely sped up some trends that were already happening. More services moving online, more use of technology to manage those programs.
Okay, that makes sense.
It also forced us to look at inequality, systemic inequality.
How so?
Well, certain groups were hit harder by the pandemic,
Oh, right.
racialized communities, essential workers, people living in poverty.
Right, so it showed that we need a system that's more fair and resilient.
Exactly. The pandemic exposed both the good and the bad in our safety net.
That's interesting.
Showed what the government can do, but also where our system falls short.
It really feels like we're at a crossroads now, doesn't it?
It does.
As we move forward, how do we take all these lessons from the pandemic, from all this history we've talked about?
Yeah.
How do we build a better system?
That's the challenge. And it's not an easy one.
No, definitely not.
But I think the key is to keep asking those tough questions.
Okay.
Keep the conversation going.
Yeah.
And never lose sight of that vision of a just and equitable society.
Right, a society where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so we've spent the last couple parts of this deep dive, really digging into the history of social welfare in Canada.
Yeah, from the very beginning.
Tracing how it evolved all the way to the 21st century. Pretty complex stuff.
It is. It's a long history.
It really shows how, values and priorities, even global events,
Yeah.
they all kind of shape these systems that support Canadians.
Right, absolutely. It highlights how social welfare isn't just this, fixed thing,
All right.
It's constantly changing, adapting.
It's dynamic. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
So, looking ahead, what are some of the big debates shaping social welfare in Canada today?
Well, one of the most fundamental ones is this tension between universal programs and more targeted approaches.
Universal versus targeted.
Yeah, so those programs that are available to everyone versus those that focus on people who are deemed, most in need.
That seems to be a recurring theme, doesn't it?
It does.
Throughout history. I mean,
yeah.
like the deserving versus undeserving, poor, even the debates about universal health care.
Absolutely. It's a constant tension.
It really gets to the heart of some big questions, doesn't it?
It does.
About individual responsibility, social solidarity, the role of government, all that.
Exactly. Big questions, no easy answers.
Are there any easy answers, though? It feels like there are good arguments on both sides.
Yeah, there are. So people who support those universal programs, they argue they're more equitable, more efficient, less stigmatizing.
Okay, that makes sense.
And they can also create this sense of shared citizenship, social cohesion.
So it's not just about the individual support. There's a societal benefit, too.
Yeah, exactly. But then you have those who advocate for a more targeted approach.
Right.
They often say that universal programs are just too expensive, but they end up benefiting people who don't really need the help.
Right. So they think resources should be focused on the most vulnerable.
Exactly. And it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
In a world where resources are limited, we have to make choices about how to use them.
Tough choices, for sure.
Yeah.
Another big debate I've heard about is whether social benefits are actually enough.
Right. The adequacy of benefits.
Yeah, are they enough to actually meet people's needs? Especially now with everything getting so expensive.
Yeah, the rising cost of living is a huge concern.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of advocates are saying that we need to increase those social assistance rates.
Yeah, they argue that the current benefits are just too low to cover, the basics.
Right. Rent, food, all that.
And that this can push people further into poverty.
Good point. What are the arguments against increasing benefits, though?
Well, the usual concerns are about costs.
Okay.
How do we pay for it?
Right.
And some people worry that if benefits are too high, it'll discourage people from working.
That'll create a disincentive.
Exactly. So it's about finding that balance again, right?
Oh.
Between providing support and encouraging self-sufficiency.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then you add in this whole issue of how work is changing, which we talked about before.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
With automation, globalization, those traditional jobs are disappearing.
Yeah, and new ones are popping up, but they're often less secure.
Right, the gig economy, contract work, all that.
It's changing fast.
It feels like the whole definition of work is kind of in flux.
It is, and this has huge implications for our social welfare system,
Yeah, for sure. What are some of the ideas people are talking about to address this?
Well, one that's getting a lot of attention is a guaranteed basic income.
A guaranteed basic income. What's that?
It would be a regular payment to everyone, no matter if they have a job or not.
Wow. That's pretty different from what we have now.
It is. But the argument is that it could be a safety net in a world where work is so unpredictable.
Right.
It could give people the chance to retrain or start a business or take care of their family without falling into poverty.
So it's like a system designed for a future where a traditional 9-to-5 job isn't the norm for everyone.
Exactly. But that's not the only idea out there, of course.
Right. What else are people thinking about?
Well, some say we need to expand access to training and education.
Okay, so people can learn those new skills that are in demand.
Yeah, exactly. Others are saying we need stronger labor rights, better protections for those workers in the big economy,
Right, because they often don't have benefits or job security.
Exactly. So there's a lot of creative thinking happening about how to navigate this new world of work.
It's exciting, in a way.
It is. And it reminds me of something.
Is that?
When we look at the history of social welfare in Canada, it shows that we can adapt,
Yeah, we've done it before.
We can find solutions to complex problems.
Right, and those solutions often involve a lot of different perspectives, a lot of debate.
Yeah, definitely. And that's what's so important about this whole conversation.
What do you mean?
The future of social welfare, it's not predetermined,
Right.
It's something we're creating together.
I like that.
It's shaped by the conversations we have, the policies we support, the actions we take.
That's empowering, in a way.
It is. And that's why it's so crucial to be informed, to understand the different perspectives, the history, all of it.
So we can make better choices.
Exactly. About the kind of society we want to live in, the kind of future we want to build.
Well said. So to wrap up this whole deep dive into the history of social welfare in Canada.
Wow, we covered a lot.
We did, from those early days to the complex system we have now.
And we've seen how it's all been shaped by economics, politics, and the efforts of so many people fighting for a fair society.
And that story, it's not over yet.
No, not at all.
Social welfare is still evolving, and the choices we make today, they'll have an impact for generations to come.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something we read about in a book,
Yeah.
It's something we're living, we're shaping it, it's shaping us.
So true. What are some of the key questions you think we should be asking ourselves about the future of social welfare as we move forward?
Well, I think one of the most important is, how do we create a system that can meet those immediate needs, the urgent stuff, but also be flexible enough to adapt to long-term changes?
Right, so it's got to be both responsive and adaptable.
Exactly. And we also need to think about how to make sure those programs are not only easy to access, but also that they actually provide enough support.
So adequacy is key.
It is. And then I think we need to foster this sense of shared responsibility,
Okay.
The idea that we all benefit when everyone has a chance to thrive.
Yeah, I love that. It's about building a society where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive today.
Wow, time flies.
It does. We've covered a lot of ground, over 400 years of history.
From those informal efforts to the complex system we have now.
It's been fascinating exploring how social welfare has changed and adapted over time.
It really has. And we've seen those shifts in thinking about poverty, responsibility, the role of government, all of it.
Yeah, it's not just about the past, though.
No, definitely not.
It's about understanding that history so we can make better decisions for the future.
Exactly. It's a living process, and we're all a part of it.
So as we wrap up, here's a final thought for everyone listening. What does a just and equitable social welfare system look like to you?
Good question.
And what role do you want to play in shaping its future?
Yeah, those are important questions. And I think this whole journey through history shows us something really important. Change is possible.
Yeah.
Progress can be made.
Right.
We can work together to create a more compassionate, a more just society for everyone.
I love that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the history of social welfare in Canada.
My pleasure.
We hope you learned some things, got some food for thought,
Yeah.
maybe even some new ideas about the kind of future we can create together.
It's been great exploring this with you.
Likewise. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.